Aldor's victorious army returned to Vulture Mountain Carrack, having secured an empire in all directions. At fortified points throughout these territories, weapons and supplies were piled as high as storehouses would allow, and then subsequently as low as the Dawi could dig. There was no shortage of gold on account of endless Tomb King riches captured during the Skeleton Wars, and thus the Umgi of Araby came to be almost entirely in Aldor's employ in one way or another. For the best, as the Umgi needed constant supervision anyway. Far, far away, the Chaos Gods were creeping from their pockets. Sigmar's empire was locked in a vicious fighting retreat against an armoured front of Chaos champions, marking the edge of an advancing hellscape of fire and despair. Those not killed wished for death, and even the very land itself broke open amid seismic shocks when the gods pounded their fists in delight. The flow of boats from the north had run dry. There were no boats left to launch. The information gleaned from those who did make it seemed to prove Aldor's original contention, that the world needed a bastion against its complete destruction. All the foul news had the teams of Dawi at the strongpoints redouble their efforts, not least those in the Atalan Carracks, where new layers were being dug and fresh chambers prepared for the eventual accommodation of the remaining Dawi. In the blue rune light of the Engineers Guild, de facto court of Lord Aldor, an updated map of the old world sat on a wide table. A hashed out area grew in segments every few days. "I don't know why I feel so unready," Story commented. "We've had our warning on this for years now. All of a sudden there it is, incomprehensible suffering, and we're here waiting for it." "Waiting in ambush," Aldor said. "Maybe you're waiting, noble Thane," Kazran said. "But most of us are working." "I understand that, but forgive my cynicism, engineers, when your kin will not dare speak with us," Story replied. "We can prepare a hold from the highest mountain to the lowest depths, but there's only us to fill it. The underway to the Karazhan core isn't clear, and if it was, it would be filled with Chaos thralls anyway." "I think you're mistaken, Thane," Aldor said. "You can't have cleared it already." "No, and we're not going to. That wasn't the plan. We're not the saviors, but the seed. Our goal is to outlast the end times until times start anew. That was always what I said to High King Thorgrin. He didn't expect a single thing from me, nor want it, I contend. He believes he'll outlast us, and then have his fun with us after. I know he's wrong. I wonder what he thinks now that Peak Pass trembles too loud to grumble over." Such speculation was halted by the sounding of alarm bells outside. Given the topic of conversation, it was natural to fear that chaos was already upon them, yet these bells were not ringing above, but below. The digging crews at the Carrack's base had broken through into what they first thought was a natural cave. Rare for a cave to be so deep, yet all too common for passageways to be clawed out by the denizens of the endless undercities of the world. Buried deeper than the dead or the Dawi, Vulture Mountain was sitting right on top of a Skaven outpost. The alarm was on account of the scurrying rats that immediately came out to investigate the illuminated, encroaching realm. No ordinary rats, of course. Even the small Skaven used as slaves for digging were just as large as the average dwarf. Fortunately, they were deficient in every other category. They seemed to barely understand where they were, dashing out of a short corridor into an unfinished hall. The oil lanterns were too bright for them to look at, yet too fascinating to ignore. The matter was swiftly contained when warriors, and indeed the regrouped miners, dashed in with a roar to slice the rats to pieces. Then the breach into the Undercity tunnels was fortified with a permanent watch. From then on, teams would venture out daily with flamethrowers, explosives, and stone melter charges, hunting out the dank Skaven nests below and collapsing the poorly made tunnels between them. Fortunately, it was not a major nexus for the Skaven, or Fegareki as the dwarves called them. The threat was crushed within a week. The whole drama, though, represented a certain milestone in the devious work going on above. The Skaven had in their possession a collection of magical items and machines unique to their strange ways, which were mostly captured intact as their operators fled. While the dark magic dabbled with thus far stood in opposition to the Aethers of Chaos, Skaven magic made use of the forgotten scraps of chaotic energy that the bloody gods had no care for. They practiced mainly in potions and poisons that were enhanced with their stinking magic in a way similar to how Khazran's dark powder was enchanted by the energy of the necromancers. Khazran then dropped everything to collect together all the Skaven artifacts he could. Ordinarily, such things would be destroyed without second thought. Khazran was most likely the first dwarf to even consider what the Fegareki nonsense could be used for, if studied and mastered. Even some of his disciples wondered if he'd also be the last, given the sacrilegious and disgustingly novel nature of such a scheme. If it wasn't for the literal end of the world going on, the political will to have him in irons might have been summoned, if he was somehow not in such a state already. Being as this was not the case, he instead was working day and night on finding a way to make incendiary Skaven alchemy into something you could fire from a gun, his go-to project for any new discovery. It was all covered up by the general activity of emergency preparations across the Atalan Empire. Back at the Black Pyramid, everything of any magical value had been pilfered. There was no sealing tombs and treading carefully this time. If the merest wisp of darkness stained the edge of a sandstone brick, it was straight on the carts for transit to the Carracks. Not much was left after that, but anything still taller than a dwarf was rigged with explosives, just to satisfy the long-starved need for a little peace of mind in such a shadowy realm. The orcs who had aided in bringing the Black Pyramid to this end were still enthralled to their idol. Aldor had the lumbering rock march up to join the citadel being built around Khemri, a city of increasing life, with the refugees now settling in and digging irrigation canals from the great river that wriggled past the city to the northern sea. The idol saw action there, stomping on the Beastmen, inevitably attracted to all this activity. The orcs had a good time with it too, eagerly taking the brunt of the damage on behalf of the local garrison. Perhaps they started to get over their disgust at being paired up with their ancient foes, when they realized that it might as well be said ancient foe doing the dying. And they were surprisingly well behaved. It was almost stomach-crawling to think that such magics could have spared countless Dawi if employed in the many greenskin wars of ages past. There was even a push for a grudge to be set against the very notion that magic was bad after all. This didn't come to pass, although the sentiment helped when it came to the devious activities of Khazran's workshop. It wasn't just Khazran there for most days during this calm before the storm. Aldor stalked the benches, constantly finding the mechanical applications of Khazran's groundbreaking theories. When it came to the Skaven potions, their foremost application was in rocketry. The Fegareki had developed a fuel that burned with only the faintest heat, yet the most violent force: warp fire. A fire not entirely of the physical world. They even had crude, scribbled diagrams suggesting its use as a propellant if one tried to read between the excited streaks of the scribes that crossed the pages this way and that. Even Aldor was skeptical of this, and focused more on the production of some more heavy-duty pieces. Firstly, he had his personal triumph in the field of gunsmithing. The automatic, self-loading, single crude, rapid-fire, compressed powder reciprocating action repeater. We might call it a Gatling gun. A ring of 8 separate barrels rotated at the end of a long magazine hung from the shoulder. A system of springs and gas exhausts at the loading end allowed the barrel assembly to be spun around by the force of a shot being fired. A fresh barrel would pass in front of the magazine and immediately have a cartridge funneled in, rotating just a split second more past the firing match, loosing another shot, which in turn powered the cycle to carry on. At the bottom of the rotation was a vacuum that sucked residue from the barrels as they span, roughly preparing them to spin back up and be used again just a second or two after the previous blast. With 8 barrels going through this process at once, the machine could fire as quickly as 20 musketeers for as long as the magazine lasted, or as long as the barrels put up with the stress in earlier designs. His second focus was on the tried and tested, the land crawler. With all the magical engines made from the spoils of the Black Pyramid, 4 new armoured vehicles were added to carry the artillery into battle, along with a crew of thunderers lining the platform on top. This had the added benefit of making what was previously the slowest part of the army, the cannons, into one of the fastest. This aided immensely as the first licks of the end times started to whip across the frontier of Araby. Assembling a new army packed with experimental gear, Aldor rushed his mechanized convoy towards Khemri. The Beastmen were carrying on their campaigns of terror, but could hardly find a morsel to eat that wasn't squirreled away in a prickly Dawi vault. When Aldor's army approached, the beasts could hardly wait to sink their teeth into some fresh meat. In the few minutes they spent in Aldor's presence, they came to know, briefly, the unbridled power of military engineering, the future of warfare on display from flank to flank. The land crawlers anchored the ends of the lines, launching cannonballs across the field that pierced the lumbering Cygors towering over the rest of the horde. Lines of golden shields protected the front. The obsidian armor of tradition had been replaced with sand-colored plates for camouflage and to reflect light in all directions, dazzling foes up close. The shield carriers had to work in close order with the new Gatling gunners behind. A small gap in the line could suddenly erupt with a flattening plume of shot, as some 70 Dawi gunners fired as hotly as 1,000. The force of it kicked sand out from under the shield line and formed little dunes. The line was moved forward so the Gatling guns could then be mounted on the dunes and fired over the top of the shields too. That is, when the size of the beasts didn't already permit shots to soar up to their targets from behind. A giant came all the way to the line, then was hammered back by the combined shooting of all the guns, knocked away as if stung by 1,000 wasps at once, and within moments unable to support its own weight on account of the huge volumes of shot being lodged into its body. Aldor's land crawler belched out a cannonball to level the beast for good. All this gives the impression that Aldor's new inventions were a roaring success. Perhaps they were, but it wasn't the Gatling guns that the Dawi remembered from this fight, nor the fights to come. It was Khazran's fantastical display of Skaven madness. He had brought along 40 warp-fire rocket launchers, and only 5 had exploded in transit from Atalan. The rest were set off from the army's rear, sending streams of fizzing green rockets arcing over the battlefield. As they tilted down and began to fall, their primary charge went off, sending out collections of smaller, unguided mini-rockets in a vague plume toward the ground. This cluster bombing was far more effective than anticipated. The secondary charges exploded against the ground and sprayed sickly warp fire among the beast horde. It worked faster than regular flames, eviscerating everything it touched instantly and leaving nothing but smoke and dust. The greater part of the battle was thus avoided, as most of the horde had been suddenly immolated. The destruction was mouth-watering for even the most prim and proper dwarf. At once Khazran had some design improvements written up to send off to Atalan, along with orders to prepare more at the double. Eye of the Panther Karak was instructed to mine for Skaven outposts to collect more materials. The ancient madness of actively seeking out the Thagaraki layers became very attractive. More attractive than the mere military practicality of the rockets would normally merit. You likely appreciate now that the sources of malign influence on the Atalan Empire were growing daily. Powerful dark powder munitions and soulstone engines. Fascination here invited the powers of Nagash and Undeath, creating weapons that sapped fleeing life to grow the ranks of the forever cursed souls. noxious warp-fire rocketry and gases, this breakthrough left the Dawi indebted to the great Horned Rat, the Chaos Overlord from whom the Skaven borrowed their powers, whose very will manifested in each flicker of warp-fire. These more meta-magical details seemed to elude true understanding among the Dawi, which is itself the most pressing evidence that these powers were at work. This was the way of corrupting darkness. It never seemed to exist in the view of those it sought to ensnare. Happily then did Nagash push Aldor's landcrawler across the desert. With glee did the great horned rat flash warp fire across the bodies of surface beasts. The minds of the Dawi softened, so much so that there on the edge of Araby, some could even hear those calls that festered among the Umgi, the whispering, cackling, comforting rumble, a sound like falling water in a deep cave, like the rolling of a great and bulging barrel of ale, the sound of the third corruption of the age, seeping from the pores of the mortal realm, through all materials, at all heights and depths, to every villain and every hero, the corruption of the Chaos realm, the malaise into which reality itself gently slid day by day. There can be no doubt that Aldor's unconventional machinations rested easily in the minds of the Dawi only because they were set there inside a cradle of looming malice. And yet, to view things in a more mortal sense, their employment was bringing absolute death and destruction to the more active agents of chaos every day. The warherd that had come to Araby ahead of the Chaos Army was destroyed entirely, some by patrolling orcs directed by gyrocopters, some by Aldor's New Age army, and others by the frustrating impenetrability of the fortifications around the remaining food. A few weeks of constant good news seemed to cement the Dawi onto their course. The plan was working, as Aldor had always imagined it would. No word came still from the Karazhan Corps, and no messenger sent returned. Far away, millions of Umgi roamed in flight from death, overtaken daily by the tireless riders of the Scourge. The true extent of the distraction couldn't be known to Araby. The absence of refugees could be interpreted in many ways after all. Confirmation of the dire state of affairs eventually came in the most simple way possible. The outriders of the Chaos Army crossed the Black Gulf and landed on Pyrrhus. Alarms were raised, and throughout the Carracks it echoed that the great enemy was upon them. Aided by the winds of darkness and the fires of the warp, Aldor's machine of salvation got to work.